Montana Territory, spring of 1882, the wind howled over the high plains as if it too had been left behind. Briar Hargrove was riding through the scrubland west of Miles City when he spotted a figure collapsed beside a wagon track, dress torn, bonnet flapping in the wind. He reined in his horse, dusty heart thudding sharp in his chest. The woman was barely conscious, her skin pale as linen, lips cracked, her hands clutched at a small satchel like it was all she had left in the world. "Miss," he said, swinging down from the saddle, "you all right?" Her eyes fluttered open sea glass green, rimmed red with exhaustion. She tried to push herself up, but her arms gave out. "Do not touch me," she rasped. "I am sick." Briar crouched anyway, his voice soft. "Then I will be strong for both of us." She blinked, confused. "My name's Briar Hargrove. I'm not leaving you here." Her mouth trembled. "They already did." He did not ask who they were. Her body told the story too thin, too worn for a woman of 23. Her dress was once fine, now threadbare. He saw the scar just above her collarbone when the wind shifted the fabric. "What is your name?" Briar asked, taking off his coat and wrapping it around her shoulders. "Tamsyn Fletcher," she whispered. "I was with a wagon train, headed for Helena. They said I was too weak. They left me behind yesterday." "Then they are fools," Briar muttered, lifting her gently. She was light, frighteningly so. The ride back to his homestead was slow. Tamsyn drifted in and out of sleep, muttering about fever and a girl named Odella. At the cabin, tucked beneath a low ridge and wrapped in cottonwoods, he laid her on his bed and stoked the fire high. He boiled water, crushed herbs, mixed powders his mother had taught him to use when he was a boy. For 2 days, she slipped between fever dreams and silence. On the third, she opened her eyes as Briar was changing the cloth on her forehead. "You stayed," she said, voice hoarse. He met her gaze. "I told you I would," her lips curved. "You should not have. Do you always argue with the man who saves your life?" "I would not say you saved it yet," he grinned, sitting back. "Well, let us see what tomorrow brings." By the 6th day, she was walking to the porch, slowly, leaning on the rail, but walking. "You do not even know what is wrong with me," she said one morning as he brought her a bowl of stew. "I know you are breathing," he replied, "and I know you are still standing. That is enough for now." She studied him. "Why are you doing this?" Briar pulled off his hat, raked a hand through his dark hair. "Because I know what it feels like to be left behind." Tamsyn looked down at her hands. "I had a daughter, Odella. She died last winter. Fever took her. My husband left before that. Said I was too soft, too sickly, not enough woman for the frontier." Briar sat beside her, quiet. "I was headed west with my sister's family. They said I was too slow. I begged them to wait. They did not." "You are not too soft," he said, voice low. "You are still here." She turned her face to the sun, tears slipping down her cheeks. In the weeks that followed, Tamsyn grew stronger. She helped Briar feed the goats, gather eggs, even tried her hand at stitching up a saddlebag. She laughed once, just once, when he slipped on ice and dropped a bucket full of water. He would have fallen 100 more times to hear that sound again. One night after supper, she sat on the porch, staring out at the hills. "I feel like I should be doing more, earning my keep." "You are," he said. "How? You are living. That is more than anyone else gave you a chance to do." She looked at him then, and this time she did not look away. "Why do you care so much?" she asked. "Because the minute I saw you, I knew I would never forgive myself if I let you fade away like you were nothing." Tamsyn swallowed hard, her voice trembling. "I am scared, Briar." He reached out, took her hand. "Then let me carry the weight just for a while. I meant what I said, Tamsyn. I will be strong for both of us." Her fingers gripped his, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself believe she was not alone. And for the first time in years, he let himself hope. The wind had not changed. The land was still harsh. But inside that small cabin under the cottonwoods, something steady had begun to grow, and neither of them wanted to let it go. The thaw came slow that year. Snow pulled back from the folds of the hills like a tide reluctant to leave, revealing patches of brown grass and brittle sage. Tamsyn stood by the creek one morning, arms crossed against the chill, watching the ice break apart in jagged sheets and drift downstream. Her reflection in the water looked like a ghost she didn't recognize, thinner, yes, but clearer somehow. Less afraid. Behind her, the door to the cabin creaked open. "There's coffee," Briar said, strong enough to put hair back on the mule. She turned to him, brushing damp strands of hair from her face. "The mule already looks like it's got a beard." He leaned against the doorway, a mug in each hand. "Then we'll call it a success." She took the tin cup from him, warming her fingers against the heat. His hand brushed hers without intention, but neither pulled away. "I've been thinking," she said, gaze drifting back to the creek. "There's a schoolhouse in Miles City. I passed it once. Just a single room, whitewashed, with a bell. Place could use a good teacher," he said. "Is that what you were?" "Not officially," she replied, "but I taught my daughter letters, numbers too. She liked to draw the sun with too many rays." Her voice faltered, but she steadied it. "I'd like to do that again. Teach, if I'm well enough." "You are," he said, no hesitation in it. She sipped the coffee, letting the quiet sit between them like a warm quilt. That afternoon, she stitched fresh patches onto Briar's work shirt with a needle he'd nearly thrown out as too dull. He watched from the table, carving a block of pine into something that might someday resemble a fox. "You always lived alone out here?" she asked, threading her needle again without looking up. "My uncle homesteaded this land with me when I was 16. He passed on 5 winters back." He paused, shaving another sliver from the wood. "Never married, either of us. Not much call for it when the next neighbor's 4 hours away and the barn roof leaks half the year." She nodded, pulling the thread through with practiced care. "Still, you kept it going." "Didn't see much sense in letting it die," he said. He worked himself near to the grave for it, felt like something ought to last. Later, she found herself standing in the small lean-to Briar used for tools and seed storage. She ran her fingers along the rough edge of a wooden crate stamped with a faded rail company name. "You've got enough seed here for 2 fields," she said as he stepped in behind her, had a mind to expand. "Never did." She turned to face him. "Then let's do it." "We can plant both." He searched her face. "You sure?" "I didn't come this far to sit quiet and fade away." A slow smile tugged at his mouth. "All right then. Come planting season, we'll break new ground." The days came longer then. Tamsyn learned the rhythm of the land when the soil softened, when the geese returned. She wore gloves 2 sizes too big, and Briar cut them down for her, muttering about folks who didn't know how to measure properly. She laughed once, and he didn't try to hide how it warmed his face. One evening, they sat by the stream again, this time with a blanket spread between them and a pot of beans simmering nearby. The sky was streaked with gold and rose, the last light catching on her hair. "Do you miss the east?" he asked. "I miss the smell of rain on cobblestone," she said. "But not the rest, not the looks, not the whispers." He tilted his head. "What kind of looks? The kind that say you're wasting space by breathing, that you ought to disappear quietly?" Briar's hands were still, resting on his knees. "I never saw you as anything but meant to be here." She looked at him then, not just with her eyes, but with the part of her that had been locked tight since before the fever took hold. "You see me whole when I've been broken a long time." "You're not broken," he said. "You're still building." She reached across the blanket, her fingers brushing his. This time he held them. The night deepened around them, soft with the sound of crickets and distant owls. And in the dark, beneath the stretch of stars, 2 people who'd been cast off by others began to build something neither of them had expected. Something stronger than what they'd lost. Something neither of them would surrender again, not for all the wind in Montana. The last frost clung stubborn to the north side of the ridge, but the soil in the lower fields had turned dark and loamy beneath Briar's plow. Tamsyn walked the furrows behind him, dropping seed with careful fingers, the hem of her skirt dark with damp earth. Her breath came even now, no rattle in her chest, no tremble in her limbs. The sickness had passed, but its ghost hadn't gone far. She felt it sometimes when she woke before dawn, heart thudding hard for no reason she could name. Briar didn't speak much while they worked. He moved steady through the rows, reins looped over his shoulder, the mule groaning under the harness. Tamsyn didn't mind the silence. She'd learned there were different kinds, and his was the good kind, the kind that left space instead of emptiness. When the sun stood high, they paused near the edge of the field where a low cedar stump offered a place to sit. Tamsyn wiped her hands on her apron and took the canteen he offered. "I dreamed last night," she said, squinting toward the horizon. Odella was sitting on a fence rail, her legs swinging, laughing at something I couldn't hear. Briar looked down, brushing dirt from his palm. "You think that means something?" "I think." She hesitated, then met his eyes. "I think she's not so far from me anymore." "Not like before," he nodded once, slow and sure. "Maybe she's waiting somewhere gentle, a place where the wind doesn't bite so hard." Tamsyn's throat tightened. "She never got to see spring, not even once." "She's seeing it now," he said, voice quiet. Later that week, Briar took her to the trading post 10 miles west, across a shallow draw and through stands of pine. Tamsyn rode behind him on Dusty, arms around his waist, the wind tugging at the ties of her bonnet. She hadn't left the homestead since the day he carried her there, and her fingers gripped tighter when they reached the open ridge. "Hasn't changed," he said, nodding to the low building with its rough porch and hand-painted sign. "Still smells like old molasses and pipe smoke." Inside, the air was thick with tallow and spice. A man behind the counter raised an eyebrow when he saw her. "Thought you'd gone east with the marshals," he said. Tamsyn met his look full on. "They left me behind," he shifted, uneasy. "Didn't know that?" "Now you do," Briar said, stepping forward just enough to make the point. "They left with sugar, lamp oil, and a spool of blue thread Tamsyn had touched only once before Briar added it to the pile. Back at the cabin, she unwrapped the thread and set it beside her needle case. "My mother used to say blue was the color of new beginnings," she said. "Your mother wise." She was stubborn. "That's almost the same thing." He leaned one shoulder against the doorframe, watching her fingers trace the edge of the spool. "You think about leaving here?" he asked. She looked up. "I think about what it would mean to stay." They didn't speak again that evening, not in words. She sat by the hearth mending a torn hem. He worked a fresh handle onto the kettle lid. The fire crackled low. Outside, coyotes called from the far hills. When the moon rose, she found him on the porch, arms folded, gaze on the horizon. "I've been thinking," she said, stepping beside him. "If I do teach, I'd want to do it here, not in Miles City, not where folks already think they know me." He turned toward her. "There's an old schoolhouse south of the ridge. Roof's gone, windows too, but the bones are still there. You think it could be fixed, with time." She looked out into the dark, the wind lifting her hair. "Then maybe that's where I start." Briar reached for her hand, rough fingers curling around hers. "And maybe I help." She didn't answer right away, but she didn't look away either. The next morning, they walked out to the broken schoolhouse. The walls leaned but held. A rusted bell lay half buried in weeds. Tamsyn ran her hand along the splintered doorframe, eyes steady. "I can work with this," she said. Briar nodded. "Then we will." The wind moved through the empty windows, but it wasn't cold, not anymore. Briar pushed the last of the shingles into place and sat back on his heels, sweat drying cold on his neck. Below, Tamsyn stood among the wild grass with her hands on her hips, squinting up at the roofline. She wore a broad-brimmed hat now, borrowed from a trunk that had belonged to Briar's uncle, and her cheeks held the kind of color that came from honest work and sun. "How's it look from there?" he called down. "Crooked," she said, shielding her eyes, "but standing." He grinned without answering and climbed carefully down the ladder. The afternoon light slanted long over the prairie, catching on the curl of old nails and the edges of broken window frames. The schoolhouse still leaned a little, but it was whole again. Inside, Tamsyn had swept out the worst of the dust. A single row of benches lined one wall, their legs uneven on the warped floorboards. She chalked a rough alphabet onto a plank nailed where a blackboard once hung. It wasn't much, but something in the air had changed. The empty space no longer felt forgotten, it felt waiting. 3 families passed through yesterday, she said, leaning against the frame as Briar joined her. One had a girl about 7. Her father asked if I knew my numbers. "You tell him." I told him I'd teach his daughter to count by 2s and to read the words on her mother's Bible. Briar leaned beside her. "You've got a way of making things steady just by standing near." She didn't look at him right away. Instead, she traced the edge of the door with her fingers. "I never imagined I'd be useful again, not in any way that mattered." "You were never useless," he said. just needed the right place to take root. She turned toward him, the corner of her mouth tugging faintly. You always talk like that, only when I mean it. The wind moved through the open windows, carrying the scent of juniper and turned soil. A bird called from the trees behind the hill, sharp and certain. Tamsyn stepped closer, close enough that their shoulders brushed. Briar, she said quietly, why didn't you ever leave this place? He looked out past the fields where the land ran flat for miles. I tried once, rode south after my uncle died, got as far as a cattle town in Wyoming. Spent a month breaking horses for a man who drank more than he paid. What brought you back? He turned to her. I've seen what happens when folks forget what they're made of. This land doesn't let you forget. It keeps you honest. Tamsyn's eyes softened. You think I belong here? With it, I think you belong wherever your hands build something and your voice calls it home. She reached for his wrist then, fingers light but certain. And what if I call this home now? I'd say I already hoped you would. They stood there as the light faded, the old schoolhouse behind them still breathing with the day's warmth. A wagon passed in the distance, its driver raising a hand in greeting. Tamsyn didn't move. Tomorrow, she said, I'm going to hang a slate at the door. Let folks know it's open, he nodded. You'll have a full bench before long. She looked up at him, the tilt of her chin quiet and steady. You'll be here, won't you? I'll be just where you need me, he said. She smiled, not the kind that flickered and fled, but the kind that stayed. Then I'm not afraid anymore. Briar took her hand, rough palm closing around her smaller one. There was nothing showy in it, nothing loud, just adjoining, long overdue behind them, the schoolhouse stood ready. Ahead the land stretched wide and waiting. But between them, there was already something built, something weathered, rooted and growing, and neither of them would ever be cast out again. The bell rang just once that morning, its rusted clapper loosened enough to sing out a clear note above the prairie grass. Tamsyn stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse, her shawl drawn close against a rising wind, watching 3 wagons approach from the southern trail. Children spilled out before the horses had even stopped, their boots thumping across the packed dirt yard, faces lit with the kind of wild hope only spring and newness could bring. Briar stood behind her, one hand resting on the doorframe, the other holding a crate of slates and chalk he'd hauled down from the loft. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Tamsyn stepped forward. By mid-morning, the children were seated 2 to a bench, their small shoulders straight as fence posts. Tamsyn wrote their names on a slate and passed it down the row, testing her memory, learning how each voice sounded when they answered her questions. She moved among them with quiet ease, her presence gentle but certain, like a willow grown strong through many seasons. Briar stayed outside, mending the hitch rail and clearing stones from the path. Around noon, he returned with a basket of cornbread and dried apples, setting it down beside the children with a nod. One of the boys, no older than 6, offered him a piece in return. Briar took it with a solemn kind of thanks. When the families left that afternoon, the children waved from their wagons. Tamsyn stood by the doorway again, her skirt dusted with chalk, her eyes full of something deeper than pride. You looked like you'd done this 100 times, Briar said as they walked the track back to the cabin. I only had to do it once to know I could, she replied. They passed the creek as the sun dropped low, its surface catching light in ribbons. Tamsyn slowed, then knelt by the bank, fingers brushing the water's edge. I didn't think I'd ever feel useful again, not in a way that left a mark. You've done more than that, Briar said. You gave something back to this place, something it didn't know it needed. She looked up at him. And what did you give it? He crouched beside her, his hand dipping into the cold water. Room to begin again. They stayed there as the sky dimmed, not speaking, the quiet between them now familiar in shape and weight. When they stood, he offered his arm, and she took it without hesitation. That night after supper, Tamsyn laid a folded piece of paper on the table. The county sent it last week. I didn't want to say anything until I was sure. Briar unfolded it slowly, reading the stamped lines, his brow furrowed as he took in the words. They've approved the school, she said. They'll send supplies, books, proper desks, but they want someone to oversee the land parcel. He looked up. You, her smile was soft. Us, they'll deed it to whoever maintains the grounds. We'd have to sign together. He set the paper down, careful, and reached across the table. You sure? I've never been more. He turned her hand over in his, tracing the lines of her palm with his thumb. Then we'll build it together, all of it. I want to stay, she whispered, not just for the school, for you, for this. He stood and pulled her to her feet. Then stay. And let me make it your home, too. She looked into his face, and the last of her doubt faded. I already feel it. Every time I wake and see that ridge out the window, every time I hear your voice. He leaned in slowly, not rushed, his hand resting at her waist. She met him halfway, the kiss unhurried, full of everything they hadn't needed to say aloud. Outside, the wind shifted through the cottonwoods, carrying the scent of smoke and tilled earth. The cabin, small as it was, seemed to breathe deeper. They married under a clear sky 2 weeks later, with the children from the schoolhouse tossing wildflowers at their feet. One of the older girls played a fiddle with more heart than tune, and a neighbor baked a pie that crumbled before it could be cut, but no one minded. Tamsyn wore a dress she'd sewn from muslin Briar had traded for in town, and he'd shaved closer than he had in years. She laughed when he nicked his chin, and he promised she'd never have to patch that razor again. They built a room off the back of the cabin that summer, just wide enough for a writing desk and a shelf of books. Tamsyn taught by day and stitched by lamplight. Briar worked the fields and carved toys for the children who stayed after class to help sweep the floor. In the evenings, they sat on the porch with their hands twined, watching the sky deepen to indigo, not needing to fill the silence between them. It was no longer empty. It was full of everything they'd found, and when the first snow came again, soft as ash, it settled on land that knew their names. They never left, they never needed to. Because what they had built was not just shelter or school or soil, it was belonging. It was love, forged slow and honest, shaped by wind and work and the quiet courage of beginning again, and it held. Always.